It's our pleasure. Welcome back, Mark Mix. He's president of the Committee and Foundation. That is the National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. He's got a bachelor's in finance from James Madison and his associate degree in marketing from State University of New York. He's worked for several state-level right to work groups before joining the National Right to Work Committee over 30 years ago. Mark, welcome back to the show. You got that right. You should hear my story. I think you're, I don't know, how old are you?
Well, I'm getting close to that milestone birthday that begins with a 6 and ends with a 0.
Yeah, I passed that a few years ago. So you're
okay. Well, I'm a young man. I feel younger already. Thank you, Andy. I appreciate that.
You're the youngster in this conversation. So, one of the things we've not heard about lately, and I think literally they're hiding the ships further offshore, is the quote-unquote supply chain crises and the backup of ships. And something like, 40-something% of all imports come through the California ports. What has happened to that? I hate the news cycles in America where they just do a story for a couple of days and they forget all about it. Are those ships still backed up out there, and to what degree do union intransigence have to do with it?
Yeah, they absolutely are, Andy. And I think the last time we talked, I think the report was there was like 105 ships that were actually out there waiting. And remember, Andy, I think you kind of pointed this out, is that, they created this buffer zone that's like 45 miles out, and these ships have to keep moving. That way they don't classify as at anchor, so they don't count. But when you fly into Los Angeles and you fly out and come out over the ocean and come back to the east, apparently you see all those ships that are out there and they're waiting. And so it hasn't gotten any better. In fact, the other day, the ILWU, the International Longshoremen and Warehouse Union Association that represents the workers and on the 29 ports on the West Coast, actually shut down the Oakland port for a day, I think, just because, they could. And, yeah, there's a big union issue here, and we've talked about that when it comes to the AB5 issue. And, the idea that independent owner-operator truckers are not servicing the ports of Los Angeles and the ports of Long Beach anymore because if their trucks are older than 2011 and or if they're not an employee of a, quote, motor carrier, then they can't service the port anymore under the AB5 rules and the so-called Clean Air Act rules that keep those older tractor-trailers and tractors out of the ports and then keep those cargo ships and container ships farther out into the ocean because, if they get too far inbound, they come under those clean air regulations that are part of the the legislative rules that went into effect, back in 2018, I think, in California.
So I know the issue of the older trucks, but are independent truckers not allowed any longer?
Well, I think there's a Supreme Court case that's waiting to be heard. The California Trucking Association has a case that's already been argued at the U.S. Supreme Court, but it has not been decided. And so if you're an independent owner-operator and you're waiting to see what the court's going to do, whether the kind of sword of Damocles is going to drop on you, what we do know, I think, and from public reports out there, that something like 70% of the trucks that were servicing those ports were kind of owner-operators, and they have kind of left because they don't know if they're going to have a future there. And so they've got to go find other work. And I think one of the things that's happened, Andy, is some of these guys have set up on the Nevada line, and the trucks bring the stuff out to Nevada, and they put it on the owner-operator trucks, and away they go into the economy, to the east. But what's happening now is a lot of the ships are actually scheduling more time to come through the Panama Canal. The ships that are coming from the Far East, they're going through the canal and they're unloading into ports in the Gulf of Mexico, in Jacksonville, and they're coming up to Charleston. Charleston's got, I think, maybe 25 or 30 ships sitting outside of their port, and what they can't find is room to put the empty containers and the chassis to move those containers in that kind of intermodal transportation system that's so important to get these products, first of all, off the boat, onto the dock, onto a chassis, into a warehouse, onto the railhead, or into a truck that will take them into the economy. And that whole system's boogered up over the last several months. And notwithstanding what the White House has said, Andy, about we solved the problem, that is nonsense. If you talk to anyone that's involved in that business out there, and I'm not, I'm just kind of following it through some websites, a website called FreightWaves, which keeps track of the transportation system, whether it be maritime or the highway tractor trailer system or the railroad system. And they've been reporting on the backlogs and the problems there, and they're predicting that we don't get this solved for another couple of quarters at least. That goes into maybe next year.
Is it true that Pete Buttigieg, our transportation secretary, is still out there measuring the height of overpasses to determine if they're racist or not?
Well, Andy, you'll have to call the Department of Transportation and talk to their official spokesman to get the whereabouts of Mayor Pete. But what we do know is this: they claimed victory over all of this, and they've talked about the $17 billion that was in the so-called bipartisan bill, infrastructure bill that goes to the ports. But Andy, now if you look at the legislation as it relates to the $17 billion that goes to ports, none of it can be used for automation. And that's one of the major issues at the ports is the idea. I think it was back in 1972 or 73. There was a very long strike, a 200+ day strike, and that battle was over containerization, whether or not the longshoremen would allow goods to be shipped in containers versus kind of the break bulk, which was you throw everything into the hull, into the cargo hold, and then you have to sort it out on the dock, which gave, lots of make work projects for lots of people. But now the containerization, and then we've talked about a new contract that's being negotiated right now with the ILWU on the West Coast. Their contract expires in July. And so one of the things we know that happens every time one of these contracts comes up is the union starts working to rule and slowing things down, so they put pressure on the ports and put pressure on the shippers, represented by the Pacific Maritime Association, to get to the bargaining table and settle it. But if you look at the salaries of those longshoremen, I mean, there are folks out there that are making over $200, almost $250, almost $300,000 a year working on the ports. And not that you argue with anybody who could make that kind of money, but when you think about that power that basically can control the movements on the docks, and it comes under this union monopoly power, then you understand that you've created a real problem. You've given a monopoly to what is basically, to your point early on in the conversation, 40% of all the imports come through those two ports in Los Angeles. That's an indictment kind of on the American economic system and your manufacturing base here in the United States, but that's the reality of it. I mean, I think if you think about the West Coast and what comes in through all the ports out there, I think 60% of all the imports in the nation come through various West Coast ports. And so giving one union the power to kind of dictate terms and conditions of how it's going to operate is really a dangerous thing.
You ever thought, since you're not quite as old as me, but neither one of us are spring chickens, did you ever think that the media was going to become so corrupt that they would never reveal any of these facts to general public, i.e. that part of the backlog is lack of automation, part of the backlog is AB5 independent truckers, part of the backlog is requiring them to have newer engines when they could use those same engines in any other state in the union? No, they never report on any of this stuff.
No, they don't, and they pay attention when the president stands up at his the amphitheater there in the White House and says, "Yeah, problem solved. We got them working 24/7." That's not even true, Andy. The 24/7 thing is not even true. And you talk to anybody that goes to the gates where they let the trucks in the morning, or where they let them come in the evening and line up. Those gates aren't open. I mean, so this 24/7 thing is all ridiculous. The fact that this easing is ridiculous. It's just not true. And you're right. The media doesn't report it, and they have an agenda for the most part. And that's why it's important that independent voices around the country have conversations like this. So listeners and readers and people that are following the news can have at least an alternative to hear some of the things that are going on. I mean, it's not hard to find it. If you go out there on the alternative media infrastructure, you can find plenty of stories about the ports and what's happening there, and it doesn't show up on CBS or NBC or MSNBC, for goodness sakes, or CNN. But then again, no one watches that, apparently.
Exactly. We're going to be back. We're going to tell you about some other California issues with Mark Mix, President, National Right to Work Committee and the National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation. To welcome you back to the show, my guest, Mark Mix, President, National Right to Work Committee. Mark, I was going to ask you, you've got an issue that in Ventura County, some employees of, was it Airgas down there?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Could you tell us about that?
Yeah, well, we've actually got a couple things going on down that way with the Teamsters Local 848, and basically we helped some Airgas employees submit a permission to basically see if they wanted to depart from the unions, and we've been helping them. We've got some NLRB cases down there for them. We just the other day settled a case for some workers with the same local, against the same local union, Teamsters 848 in Long Beach, and a company called Savage Services, where basically 13 employees were forced with the decision, at least the Teamsters wanted to force them to join the union or lose their jobs. In fact, the Teamsters wrote a letter to the employer saying that these workers didn't fill out their membership cards and pay their full dues, that the employer needed to fire them. And fortunately, the law doesn't allow that. While union officials won't tell workers that, we got involved in the case, and unfortunately, the union and the NLRB did a unilateral settlement that actually said the workers could keep their jobs, and it rebated some of the money that was forcefully taken from them by the union illegally. And the issue there was real simple, Andy, that we had won a U.S. Supreme Court case. Our lawyers argued and won a case back in 1988. This is how difficult the battle is sometimes. We won a case in 1988 that protects private sector workers from being forced to pay for politics and ideological causes which they would disagree with. Unfortunately, when you join a union, and the union, whether you want to do it voluntarily or whether you think you have to because a union contract is stuck in your face and it says you must be a member in good standing of the union, and the union organizer says, well, that's pretty clear, isn't it? You got to be a member of the union. Once you sign up, you pay full dues, and that means you support their political agenda. Well, in the case of Harry Beck versus Communication Workers of America back in 1988, we got the Supreme Court to say, well, we can still force a worker to pay something to the union to work in America. We can't really force them to pay for politics and causes which they disbelieve. And so they gave this relief to workers, and really it's kind of a double-edged sword, because while you can protect your ideological rights, you really can't protect your workplace rights. You have to make a decision between one or the other. And so these employees at Savage Services down in Los Angeles, in that area, were basically told they had to join the union and told that they had to pay full union dues. They found out that they didn't want to do that. They found our Legal Defense Foundation. We ended up helping them with their National Labor Relations Board case. And the region of the National Labor Relations Board, which is the agency back here in Washington that basically adjudicates labor policy for all private sector workers across the country, obviously not agricultural workers. And as you know, out in California, you've got your own California Agricultural Labor Board that takes care of that quite nicely. I'm using my finger quotes there. But the point is that these workers got a hold of us. Our employees helped them exercise their rights. They got the money that was taken from them illegally rebated, and they got to keep their jobs. And there's still an ongoing fight out there about whether or not the union will continue to represent them. But we've had a lot of work out in California, not only on behalf of private sector workers, but public sector workers. In fact, we brought a case to the U.S. Supreme Court back in 2014 that actually protected California government workers from being forced to pay for a forced political contribution that was used way back in 2005 against Governor Schwarzenegger to fund a ballot proposition to basically beat back some ballot propositions that would have limited union power. So there's a lot of work to do in California. Of course, we know that I think, 1 out of every 9 Americans is from California, so it's no surprise that we have lots of work out there.
So one of the things that, I don't know if you and I have talked about this, but the big move in our region, including Ventura, City of Santa Barbara, County of Santa Barbara, and other communities, are project labor agreements or community workforce agreements. And Santa Barbara County, which I serve as a watchdog to them, their attitude is, hey, we negotiate with unions all the time, deputy sheriffs, county fire, SEIU, so why shouldn't we negotiate directly with construction unions? And I've never seen that leap of logic in my 30 years of doing this, is because we said, well, why don't you have unions and construction companies at the table together? Well, we don't need to do that. We'll just negotiate directly with the unions alone. And that's what they're doing. Are you guys fighting those policies?
We have, Andy, and in fact, from a legislative perspective, the National Right to Work Committee follows and basically has helped in some states pass those prohibitions to project labor agreements. And then, of course, litigation-wise, we've worked on them too from our Legal Defense Foundation. What the project labor agreement basically says is that you're going to take 87% of the construction workers in America and you're not going to let them work on any job that has government money in it. That's basically what a project labor agreement is. It says the union and the county commission or the city council or the state of California have agreed that the only construction that can be done when government money is involved in it is you have to have a union contract. You have to have union provisions in your contract. And basically what we know and California is a perfect example of this, we know that those agreements sometimes can increase costs up to 30%. And project labor agreements, frankly, the unions will say, well, this is designed to make sure that we're on budget and on time. And I can tell you the data about on budget and on time for union construction projects is scarce. It is scarce. And, construction union officials talk about it all the time. Well, you know what you're doing. Well, what they've actually doing is they're saying there's no competition when it comes to government construction. And I think, Andy, you may remember, we got involved in this case where they were actually saying any private sector construction would have to be under Davis-Bacon and, kind of the notion of the project labor agreement that union contractors would have to be involved in private construction, and that was struck down. But if there's government money in it, now they're saying that, you gotta have union construction, and Joe Biden's pushing that in the infrastructure bill. They're pushing it in the so-called Build Back Better bill. All that language that would basically say to 87% of the construction workers in the country and those that own those construction companies saying, look, either unionize or don't work on any of these projects. That's not good for taxpayers. It's not good for workers, and it's not good for the people of California. That's for sure.
Or is the Supreme Court inclined, like for instance in California, to take any of these up? Because to me, it's a fiduciary issue of not awarding contracts to the lowest responsible bidder. So to me, it's a giveaway of public funds.
Yeah, the legal theory there, Andy, is kind of an interesting one. Basically, what the courts have said, and whether it's gotten to the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm not aware of that. We have not been involved in a case that's gotten that far. But what they basically say is that the government is acting as a, quote, market participant. And the idea of a market participant is they can set the terms and conditions of the particular project that they are in the market for or the market to get provided to them. And so they're acting like a regular business. And so they can say these are the conditions on this. Now, what your point is well taken, Andy, because some states have bidding laws that say, look, you've got to let the contract go to the most competent, least cost bidder on a project. And obviously, if Jim's Construction comes in and says, we want to do the Golden Gate Bridge, you're going to say, well, Jim, show me the experience that you've had on the Golden Gate Bridge. He can't. So there's that notion of someone who can actually do the work, has a history and has experience of doing that type of work, and saying, you can't compete even though we know you can do the job 10% cheaper and we can save tax dollars. I mean, for schools in Ohio, we worked on a project out there in the legislature where they basically exempted school construction and school renovation from project labor agreements in Davis-Bacon. Davis-Bacon specifically, the so-called union wage. And it turned out after the whole process was over, they could do 3 schools and get 1 for free because of the savings and those buildings. This notion that somehow a union card makes the building better is really laughable in the sense that most of the construction that goes on in the country is done by well-trained non-union workers who are good at what they do. And to eliminate them and exempt them from building things that have government money in it is really it doesn't make any sense really when you think about it.
All right. Hey, thank you for being on the show and bringing these California cases and issues to us today, Mark.